Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, what do you think of Ahimsa, nonviolence against sentient beings?
I think that it is the noblest abstinence that one can practice. It is to, in all things we do, seek not to cause any kind of harm, pain, injury, death, or despair on any sentient beings whatsoever, including ourselves. By doing this, we can liberate ourselves and others from samsara.
It seems so difficult to actually achieve this ideal. With every step we take, we stomp on insects and other small beings. With any food we eat, we deprive another being of that very same food. We take up space, we produce waste, and we cannot achieve perfect harmony with all other living things in this world.
This is true. It is very difficult to achieve perfection of Ahimsa. Failing that, being aware of that harm that we do, and seeking to minimize that harm as much as we possibly can, is that very noble aspiration of Ahimsa in practice. Even just knowing what harm we do in the world is better than going through life carelessly.
I suppose so. I have often heard that those who know better do better. This is the power and necessity of wisdom. I have my doubts about that, but I do still believe that knowing is better than not knowing.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing the first moral precept in Buddhism. What is the first moral precept of Buddhism? What is its significance? How have interpretations of it changed over time? We hope you enjoy.
So let's get to it. What is the first moral precept of Buddhism?
The first moral precept is known in Sanskrit as Ahimsa, or in English as nonviolence against all sentient beings. It's derived from the Sanskrit root hims, meaning to strike, or himsa, which means injury or harm. Combined with the prefix a, it literally translates to non-harm. This is a fundamental ethical principle of many Indian religions, such as Hinduism, Jainism, and of course, Buddhism. It first appears in what we now consider to be Hindu texts dating back to the Vedic period, which we've mentioned before as spanning from roughly 1750 BCE through 500 BCE. It came up as a moral argument from time to time, but it did not really become emphasized in the texts until the late Vedic period, very near to the birth of the Buddha. Thus, it's important to note that it was part of the religious ecosystem into which the Buddha was born. If we look at him, his life, and the emergence of Buddhism historically, we could say that Ahimsa, like the concept of samsara or the gods Indra and Brahma, were imported into Buddhism from Hinduism. However, I think that there is a fundamental difference between Ahimsa in Vedic texts and Ahimsa in Buddhism. First and foremost, in Hinduism, it was regarded as a high virtue, but it was not presented as being inherently necessary to achieve liberation from samsara. In Buddhism, it's absolutely necessary for achieving release from samsara, and it's presented as such from the very beginning. In Hinduism, it also is not defined in a really specific fashion. There are passages in the Vedas that say things like, quote, "May we all not hurt each other," or "strive for non-injury and non-harm," unquote. But they don't really speak to what that actually means. Do we seek not to harm each other with words? Do we seek not to harm each other physically? And what about animals? Is it morally permissible to harm or kill animals? There are, to my knowledge, no answers to those questions in the Vedas. On the other hand, Buddhist texts outline many different kinds of injury/harm and denounce all of them. Ahimsa is also a core principle of Jainism, another Indian religion that developed around the same time as Buddhism. Jainism develops the definitions, the significance, and the implications of Ahimsa more than any other religion on earth. Jainism adopts a very extreme perspective on Ahimsa, as we've discussed before. Jain people will wear face masks to prevent breathing in microorganisms and killing them. They will sweep the ground in front of them to prevent stepping on bugs and killing them. And they will practice veganism or vegetarianism as a means of reducing harm to animals. In Jainism, like in Buddhism, Ahimsa is fundamentally necessary for reaching liberation from samsara, and they take it more urgently and seriously even than in Buddhism. The cosmological rationale to the practice of Ahimsa in Jainism is that any acts of violence against another, be it an animal, another person, a bug, a microorganism, etc., is intrinsically indistinct from violence to oneself. In Jainism, sentient beings have souls, and these souls are stained or are encumbered with karmas when they commit evil acts, which prevents them from achieving liberation. Unlike in Buddhism, karmas are literal dark matter that weighs down the soul and prevents its ascension. Thus, by an act of violence, a soul may or may not injure the soul of someone else, but always causes injury to its own soul by binding it with karmas. There are 4 types of Ahimsa and 5 specific transgressions of Ahimsa in Jain scriptures. The 4 types are intentional violence, self-defense, which is actually morally permissible, domestic or household violence, and occupational violence, referring to violence in the context of one's job, such as harming an animal in the course of agriculture or declaring war as a king. The 5 major types of transgressions of Ahimsa are the binding of limbs or trapping, beating, mutilating limbs, overloading or over-encumbering, and withholding food and drink. To commit any of these kinds of transgressions, intentionally or unintentionally, is regarded as morally wrong in Jainism. Ahimsa is the core ethical principle of all of Buddhism as well, but it is situated quite differently than in Jainism and in other Indian religions. In Buddhism, committing violence does not create black matter that weighs down our souls, because there are no souls to weigh down. Instead, it creates bad karma in the Buddhist context, a series of outcomes and repercussions that are morally unwholesome for the person committing the violence, but also for others as well. These repercussions serve as causes for further unwholesome events, and the cycle moves on, rebirth after rebirth. This moral momentum determines our position in the Buddhist cosmology. For more on karma in Buddhism, check out episode 4, What is Karma? The link will be in the show notes. In Buddhism, ahimsa means the abstinence from any kind of harm, intentional or unintentional, toward any sentient being. It is important when understanding sentient beings in Buddhism to leave behind our modern Western scientific view of living and non-living and of sentient beings. In Buddhism, the taxonomy is much less specific and fleshed out than in modern-day biology because Buddhism predates Western science by 2,200 years. In Buddhism, a sentient being is defined as a being that is visible to the naked eye, that moves at an observable speed, that lives and dies, and that has a vijnana, or consciousness. For more on what a vijnana is, refer to episode 19, What is Yogacara, and to our readings of the Lankavatara Sutra. Bugs are sentient beings, rocks are not. Animals are sentient beings, but plants and fungi are not.
What is Ahimsa's significance?
It's the most crucial ethical principle in all of Buddhism. 4 of the 5 gravest sins that one can commit are transgressions of Ahimsa, namely, killing one's mother, killing one's father, killing an arhat, and killing a Buddha. It is the first of the 5 or 10 moral precepts. If anybody were to ever ask me what Buddhism is in a single word, I would probably say Ahimsa. Even if Buddhists don't take it to the lengths that Jains take it, it is still the cornerstone to all Buddhist practice, and it represents a guiding principle for all other moral practices in Buddhism. In other words, it's possible to say that, in a way, all moral precepts, all practices and abstinences in Buddhism flow forth from this singular principle of non-injury to oneself or others. Its significance cannot be overstated. In understanding and discussing Ahimsa, there are various limits and bounds that come up in the text that we should discuss. Particularly, are there any points where violence is permissible, such as in the case of self-defense in Jainism? Also, what specifically counts as violence in Buddhism? Are we talking about killing, injuring, verbal abuse, general violence, or all of the above? In Buddhism, there are separate moral precepts for morally transgressive speech and thoughts, so those do not necessarily fall under the technical definition of ahimsa alone. But they are regarded similarly because morally transgressive speech or thoughts can lead to violations of ahimsa in the future, and that is just as morally bad as doing it yourself. This is crucial in Buddhism. Inducing others to commit violence is just as wrong as doing it yourself. Thus, the immoral speech and thoughts that a person has as they cause themselves or someone else to be violent is part and parcel of that very violence. To reiterate, ahimsa in Buddhism usually specifically refers to the taking of another sentient being's life, but all other forms of violence, such as beating, abusive speech, abusive thoughts, etc., are regarded as morally transgressive as well because of ahimsa. This is how all moral precepts and all practices and abstinences flow forth from ahimsa. They go toward preventing the potential for violence and also reducing existing and ongoing violence done to oneself or others. Now, what about situations where others are violent toward us? As we've said in other places on the show, it only takes one person wanting violence for there to be violence. In Jainism, violence as self-defense is only forgivable if it's a last resort. No other options can be available. In a truly universal sense, these situations are regarded as being exceptionally rare. From a mundane human perspective, there may be tons of situations where there's no other option. However, Jainism, being as strict as it is about Ahimsa, takes a far more extreme perspective and argues that de-escalation is possible way more than we may think. As humans with self-preservation instincts, we will resort to self-defense to prevent injury or death. But according to Ahimsa, we are only permitted to use self-defense to prevent absolute certainty of death. And then, that violence is still a stain on the soul. If one uses self-defense when it's not the absolute last resort, then that is still a grave transgression of Ahimsa. Unlike in Jainism, violence is not permissible in self-defense situations in Buddhism. We're supposed to have so little attachment to our life and our body that we would not harm others to preserve it. This is exemplified by the parable of the hungry tigress. This is from the Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's past lives. In a past life, the Buddha was born into a wealthy family, but he renounced, and he sought out a place to practice meditation. On a path, he sees a starving mother tiger about to eat her young. There wasn't any suitable food for a tiger in the area, so he saw fit to sacrifice his own body as food to prevent the tigress from eating her young. This story is primarily about self-sacrifice and a lack of egotistical attachment to one's life and body, but it's also about Ahimsa. It tells me that when we are about to be eaten by a tiger, it would show excessive attachment to the self and to one's life to stop that from happening, because you're valuing your body and your life over the life and body of others, which is at the very least unfair, but also regarded as selfish. However, this does not all mean that when somebody's violent toward us, that we're supposed to just lay down and take it. For more on that, check out our next episode where we'll be discussing what Buddhism argues we ought to do when we're wronged.
How have interpretations of Ahimsa changed over time?
Ultimately, I think that the moral precept of Ahimsa has relaxed in many ways over time. Early in Buddhism's history, it had very few, if any, qualifiers or caveats. It was regarded as universally bad karma to harm any other sentient being, regardless of the situation or context. In this way, it was very simple as a rule, but very difficult to implement in one's life. When Mahayana Buddhists ended up critiquing the difficulty of the earlier path, this was one of the points that they emphasized. It is impossible to be born, live, and die without harming other sentient beings. Obviously, non-harm and non-injury towards others is an ideal which we ought to strive for, but human life is contrary and contradictory to the life of some other organisms. For example, pests, predators, and parasites. Our whole existence is dependent on our ability to defeat that which would kill us. Even if we eat only plant products, we still have to kill insects and pests to grow the food. We still have to kill insects and pests in our homes, and we have to keep living things that are harmful to our health away. I think that it's even more difficult to live harm-free in the modern era. Driving cars pollutes the air. The products we use rely on exploitative labor, and our homes we keep disrupt the environment and the ecosystem. There are even some arguments out there that the supply chain for vegan foods, for example, is just as pollutant and wasteful as the supply chain for meat and animal products, if not more. If I remember correctly, I read somewhere that it consumes a great deal more water to produce a gallon of almond milk as opposed to dairy milk, and that's water that could support villages and towns in places experiencing fresh water crises all over the world. Thus, Ahimsa is an ideal, but it is regarded by Mahayana Buddhists as impossible to realize, at least in its earliest iteration. As early Buddhism became Mahayana Buddhism, more and more reformulations and reimaginings of Ahimsa came about. As part of the larger trend of questioning and challenging early Buddhist ethics, early Mahayana thinkers came to ask the question, if violence is unintentional, if it is out of one's control, if it is necessary, is it as morally reprehensible as when somebody kills out of jealousy, pride, or hate? The answer they come up with is no. The reason why is similar to what we discussed in episode 62, what is the moral status of carnivorous animals? The link of this will be in the show notes as well. Samsara sucks, and bad things happen in it. We are animals, and our individual karmic situations lead us to experience bad circumstances and to create bad circumstances. Just like I mentioned a moment ago, it is impossible to achieve non-harm as a human being living in samsara. We ought to strive to rise above the inherent immorality of life in samsara, but we shouldn't act like people who don't or can't are less than. Especially with the advent of the doctrine of Buddha nature, people who break the moral precepts are looked upon with far more compassion than previously. Instead of being immoral or evil people, people who break the moral rules are seen as people who have temporarily fallen from grace and deserve a little help getting back to it. Additionally, the doctrine of Ahimsa becomes more interpreted as don't kill or harm living things unnecessarily. This specifies that you shouldn't lose sleep or panic over the background harm that comes from being a human being with needs for food and water and shelter, but you should abstain from purposeful and unnecessary harm. As Mahayana further develops, the compassion of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas becomes more emphasized, and they're even regarded as extending even more grace and compassion toward immoral people than to moral ones, because they need it more. I'm thinking of Pure Land thinker Shinran's famous exclamation, quote, "Even a good person attains birth in the Pure Land. How much more so the evil one?" Unquote. This speaks to how Amida Buddha's compassion goes to everyone, but he has extra pity for those who truly need it. This is a complete flip over of morality from previous conceptions. In later Mahayana, there are also cases where violence is implied as a means of teaching the Dharma, in which case the ends justify the means. This concept comes up in Nichiren Buddhism called shakubuku, which refers to an aggressive means of spreading the teaching. In this sort of situation, the ends justify the means because it refers to defeating or breaking down the naysayers against the Dharma. This could be through argument and debate, but it's also been interpreted by some extremist Nichiren Buddhist groups as a violent approach to convincing people of the truth of the Dharma. Thus, violence done in the name of the Dharma, or in protection of the Dharma, is understood to be righteous, and therefore permissible. Importantly, this is only the view of some fringe groups across history. Most Buddhists do not feel that this is a useful or resonant doctrine, especially in this day and age. All in all, I think that there are two important modes or aspects to Ahimsa. In one mode, it is an exhortation to avoid or abstain from harming sentient beings. This is a negative command, don't do something. In the other mode, it is an exhortation to seek the opposite of harm for all sentient beings, and the opposite of harm is compassion. This is a positive command, do X. In Buddhism, this compassion levels up from the small scale, such as holding a door for somebody, all the way up to the universal scale, such as leading somebody to enlightenment via the Dharma, and everything in between. Practicing this compassion goes toward minimizing the total amount of harm in the world. These two modes operate hand in hand in Ahimsa. You can't have one without the other. There's no middle ground, because to be compassionate is to abstain from harm, and to abstain from harm is compassionate. These are two sides of the same coin. I think that this is the simplest way to understand Ahimsa.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of the first moral precept. Join us next time where we will be discussing conflict resolution in Buddhism. How does Buddhism argue that one must respond when they have been wronged? Does it teach that you should just take it and not respond at all? How does this relate to Buddhist-influenced martial arts? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
If you enjoy our show and would like to support us, we ask instead that you send that money to a worthy cause. For now, we are asking you to support the World Food Program Emergency Assistance for Palestine. Palestinians are facing genocide, in part caused by weaponized famine. If you can, please join us in helping alleviate their suffering. Thank you.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.